Yeah, I'm very happy to uh, spend the next hour today, or probably a little bit less than an hour, because I want to give a lot of time for discussion, as this is kind of a position talk that's based on a position paper that I had written while I was at Araya with some of my colleagues at Araya. And the basic idea here is that we were interested in exploring this link between conscious function and general intelligence. Does this link exist? Um, and if it does exist, in what ways can we take advantage of this link in order to motivate the development of more advanced artificial intelligence systems? So I'm very eager to hear what people think um, as far as the things that we might be able to take from research into conscious function and apply to AI. Okay, yeah, so kind of the motivation for this line of work was thinking about AI's representation in popular media. So if you look at any kind of sci-fi book or movie, what you find is that there's often this portrayal of superhuman intelligences that develop, and these intelligences are often also conscious in some kind of important way. So it seems that at least in the popular imagination, there's some kind of link between consciousness and intelligence. We were interested in asking, well, is this link something that's just a kind of folk intuition, or is there something a little bit deeper to it? In order to ask this, we can turn to the study of consciousness, which of course, many speakers have come to the Consciousness Club and talked about. And there are many different perspectives on what it means to study consciousness, and many different ways to study consciousness. In fact, when people say consciousness, they mean many possible different things. Here in this talk and in this work, we're interested in a somewhat narrow definition. Instead of kind of engaging with questions of phenomenology, qualia, metaphysics, we're going to limit our understanding of consciousness here to something that I'm calling cognitive information access. And in particular, we're going to be associating this cognitive information access with an idea of a functional role of consciousness in biological organisms. Now, we can get to this functional role through a few different philosophical pathways. Here, I highlight just two kind of entry points to this way of thinking. One from Daniel Dennett, who poses this idea of a hard question of consciousness to contrast the kind of hard problem that had been posed in the past. So the idea of the hard question is, what is it that consciousness is actually for in organisms, which of course begs the question and makes the presupposition that there is some functional role that consciousness plays. Certain dynamical systems have consciousness, other systems don't. Those systems with consciousness have certain kinds of abilities, and therefore those abilities are correlated with consciousness. And we can study what those abilities allow those organisms to do. Secondly, we have Ned Block's distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. With access consciousness being in particular this idea that the content of access consciousness corresponds somehow to what we are aware of and what we are able to report on. And once again, what we're aware on and what we're aware of and what we can report on is something that we can make a kind of explicit scientific inquiry into. These two things allow us to make this kind of functionalist case for cognitive information access. So things that we have in our awareness that we can report on are things that we have in some sense access to. So we can then, with this kind of basic grounding, we can turn to some of the theories of conscious function that have been developed over the past few decades that attempt to describe something along the lines of the system that we've been talking about here. Right, so here we'll talk about these three different theories: global workspace theory, information generation theory, and attention schema theory. And each of these three provide a different perspective on the kinds of mechanisms that correspond to what does and doesn't enter conscious awareness, and how and why it does it or it doesn't enter it. And most importantly, each of these three theories corresponds to and confer certain kinds of cognitive abilities on the organism that possesses the systems that the theory describes. And as we'll discuss, these cognitive abilities are then also correlated ultimately with intelligence. The first theory is the global workspace theory, which was introduced in the 80s, which basically posits that we can kind of think of or reason about the brain as being decomposed into a system of modules or which share information through some kind of cognitive shared common representational space. This shared representational space being itself the global workspace. The idea, the part of this that has to do with consciousness is that the information that is within the shared global workspace corresponds to what we have conscious access to. And that entry into the global workspace is governed by what the theorists behind the global workspace refer to as ignition events. And then information is then sent from the global workspace to the rest of the modules in the brain via this process of broadcasting. In the decades since the original proposal of global workspace theory, there have been a number of kind of developments and elaborations of the theory. I think one kind of contemporary piece of relevant evidence for it comes from a 2018 study suggesting that this kind of feedback from the prefrontal cortex, sustained activation in the prefrontal cortex, is required for conscious report of the visual stimuli. So you can see the kind of dynamics of that here on the figure on the right, where you have some visual presentation of some stimuli. Information is proceeding up the visual hierarchy. The idea being that if enough information for a long enough period of time with a strong enough signal is able to maintain activation at the most frontal regions, this leads to this kind of ignition event where the stimuli enters the global workspace, enters awareness, and then is ultimately broadcast to all relevant other parts of the brain. We can then move on to the second theory, information generation theory, which was recently proposed by Kanai and colleagues. And this suggests a slightly different mechanism corresponding to the functional role of consciousness. Here in information generation theory, the idea is that it's not first order sensory experience, but rather information generated by the brain itself, which corresponds to the content of conscious awareness. Another way of interpreting this is, for example, within the framework of Carl Friston and colleagues in the hierarchical predictive coding framework. A typical kind of diagram used for this group of interpretations is this idea of interpreting the brain as a kind of variational autoencoder, where you have some kind of encoder and decoder with bottom-up and top-down signals, with only the top-down signals corresponding to the consciously perceived information. So there's a number of pieces of evidence that kind of support the information generation theory approach of looking at conscious function. One that's worth bringing up here that we bring up in the paper is this idea of form agnosia that's been studied with these male slit experimental paradigm. So individuals with form agnosia are unable to report on the angle of the slit in which they have to place a piece of mail into. But then they're able to actually perform the task without any problem, as long as the visual stimuli is presented to them. But when the visual stimuli is removed, they are both unable to report the angle and unable to actually match the correct motor task. So the interpretation of this in light of the information generation theory is that what's missing in these form agnosia patients is the ability to, in the absence of sustained visual input, to generate internally a representation of the relevant visual context. In this case, that would be the male slit and the angle at which it exists. The third theory we consider is attention schema theory, which is also a more recently proposed theory. The idea here is that, once again, the content of conscious experience corresponds not to a first-order process. Here, they contrast it with the first-order attentional process, but rather they suggest that the content of conscious awareness corresponds to this second-order model of the attentional process itself. The idea here being that the benefit that this kind of second-order model of the attentional process confers on individuals is the ability to make kind of metacognitive introspections about the state of one's own attention, and to thus dynamically adapt that attention to the context. So a way of thinking about this would be represented in the diagram here on the right. So we have A at the top. The first order attentional view would simply be that you have some individual, some organism who's perceiving an object, in this case an apple, and then has some representation of the apple. And of course, there's some attentional process at work here. Out of all of the things that this individual could be attending to, they're attending, in this case, exclusively to the apple. But here in the attention schema theory view of things, we have, once again, an individual who's attending to an apple, but the representation that the conscious content that the individual has is both the fact that there is both the apple itself and the fact that they're attending to the apple, right? And so it's this representation of the attentional process that is kind of special, you could say, about the attentional schema theory, and that is also particularly relevant for conferring particular cognitive benefits. So within the literature, the attention schema theory has been associated with the temporal-parietal junction. I think there's also good evidence that it probably has a connection to the prefrontal cortex as well, given that there's a lot of literature suggesting the prefrontal cortex is important for the maintenance of these kind of cognitive schemas. And I think the attention schema theory can be interpreted as another kind of cognitive schema, one representing attentional processes in particular. In terms of empirical evidence, the attention schema theory, the authors of the original work cite evidence for the dissociation between attention and awareness. So the ability of individuals with various forms of brain damage to be able to attend to stimuli without necessarily being aware of or able to consciously report that stimuli. And then there are also, of course, being the possibility of the double dissociation as well. So that was a brief overview of these three theories. Each has a kind of quite extensive literature around them. But hopefully I've given you at least enough to get a sense of the basics of each of them and how each of them kind of importantly differ from one another. So to kind of summarize each of these three theories, I have this high-level schematic of each. So I'll just walk through each of them here. So on the left, we have the global workspace theory, where the basic idea is that you have some group of cognitive modules. Here, I'm having sense modules and motor modules represented, but you could imagine memory modules, internal representational modules, affective modules, any kind of like relevant computational module you might think about in the brain. Each of these then interact through a global workspace through these kinds of bidirectional connections where information gets sent up through these ignition events and then are broadcast through the global workspace back to other modules through broadcasting events. Next, we have the information generation theory. And here we have a similar story of this kind of like bidirectional system where you have a group of modules and they are passing information back and forth to an information generator. Here, things aren't necessarily governed by dynamics of ignition and broadcasting. And importantly, there is also some sort of system which structures the information generator. Right, so this will be quite important a bit later, but for now it's relevant to keep in mind that, for example, cognitive maps structure the information which gets generated. Lastly, there's attention schema theory, and here again we have a similar diagram where we have some attentional system over some group of modules. But here we have the attentional system being modulated by a separate attentional schema, which is this kind of second order meta representation of the attentional process. And I forgot to mention, but it is of course relevant that each of the highlighted boxes for each of these three diagrams corresponds to the consciously accessible information. Right, so here the idea is that the information in the global workspace is what's consciously accessible. Here it's the information being actively generated, and here it's the information represented in the attentional schema itself. Great. So with a bit of an understanding of the approach we're taking to consciousness and some of the relevant contemporary theories of conscious function, we can now kind of turn to the other side of the coin, which is this question of what is intelligence? How do we measure it? How do we quantify it? And how does it manifest in both natural and artificial agents? So as you might imagine, similar to consciousness, there have been a great many proposed definitions of intelligence over time, and there's been great debate in the literature over how one should define intelligence and how one should measure intelligence. Here we adopt a recent definition proposed by Francois Chollet, building on others, And I think that this definition is good because it avoids a lot of the anthropocentric trappings that a lot of typical definitions of human intelligence have fallen into in the past, that rely on things to do with, for example, the deployment of language, or the building of tools, something like this. But it also is grounded enough to still be both relevant to humans and animals, and to be applicable to artificial agents. So what is this definition? So my paraphrasing of the definition is what's italicized right here. So from the definition that we're adopting is the ability to acquire novel skills with little previous experience, knowledge, or skill-specific prior ability. And the kind of key aspect here is that we're interested in skill acquisition, learning things that we haven't learned before, with as little experience, knowledge, or priors possible. So you could imagine this being turned into a kind of equation where you have a numerator and a denominator. Within Chole's paper, he actually goes so far as to provide explicit equations you can use, for example, algorithmic information theory to kind of derive a quantifiable number for this value. Here, we're going to be using it more as a guide to understanding a kind of like ordinal comparison of agents' abilities. Importantly, this suggests that intelligence and general intelligence exists on a kind of continuum rather than a binary. So it is the case that as agents are more intelligent, they can acquire more skills faster with less experience, previous knowledge, or fewer priors, right? And the more an agent can do this, the more generally intelligent they're said to be. Now it's worth digging into this just a little bit more. So what do we mean by experience, knowledge, or priors? So in the case of artificial agents, we can think about these things like items in a data set, time steps in a control problem. I think in humans, it's quite clear that we can think about this purely as like seconds alive. We can think about this as years of experience on a job. Knowledge we can think about in the case of artificial agents is kind of how we've curated the data sets, the handwritten rules that have been built into intelligent systems. All of these kinds of pre-existing knowledge about the problem to be solved that ends up getting baked into the system to solve the problem. In the case of humans, this can correspond to books that have been read, courses that have been taken, etc. Then we have kind of this more nebulous idea of priors, which more or less correspond to these kind of like higher level structural dispositions that a given agent might have to being able to solve a specific kind of problem. So in the case of artificial agents, this might have to do with the specific nature of the architecture. So if it's a neural network architecture, and you use like a convolutional neural network, this provides certain kinds of invariances to an agent that might be using this architecture. Different kinds of loss functions might provide other kinds of priors. And there's quite a big debate about what kind of priors humans have or don't have, which I'll discuss a bit shortly. So just to summarize this idea of intelligence, so assuming we have two agents that are learning the same task, if one agent learns it with less experience, knowledge, or priors, then we say that that agent is more generally intelligent. And also what importantly follows from this is that being able to solve more tasks or even more complex tasks doesn't necessarily make an agent more intelligent. Yes, so these are all important things to take into account, and I think the relevance of them will become apparent as we start to discuss instantiations of intelligence in agents. Okay, so we can start with human-like agents, the animal class. So if we look to the animal kingdom, we find that most animals are capable of some form of learning. It's often simple associative learning, but it goes, to quite a broad spectrum of animals. And so this suggests that even if it takes a large amount of experience, and even if the classes of skills that can be learned are relatively small, all animals have some amount of intelligence. Now we can then start to compare more intelligent animals like birds and mammals to humans. And here we find kind of like the relevant numerical comparisons. So for example, there's evidence looking at skill acquisition, where birds and mammals can learn similar tasks to humans, but they often require orders of magnitude more experiences to do so. So that's like a much greater denominator in this kind of intelligence equation. So compared to a lot of animals, we often find that humans require fewer priors, previous knowledge or experience. But importantly, and as I alluded to, there's a lot of debate about what priors humans do or don't rely on. For example, from Chomsky onward, there's been a very lively debate about whether humans have a built-in priors around language capacity. And of course, for example, just to dive in on this a little bit further, so to the extent to which humans have a strong prior for language, then humans' ability to learn language relevant skills is less a demonstration of general intelligence and more just a demonstration of the fact that this is an effective prior. So this kind of gets at a bigger point, which is the fact that, as I mentioned before, general intelligence exists on a spectrum, but also it's clear that all agents need to have some kinds of priors, because the space of all possible things we might be interested in is just too big. So even though we often refer to humans as being generally intelligent, it's clear that we're taking advantage of certain specific kinds of priors, which kind of limit the domains in which we're actually thinking about general intelligence. There has been, within the psychology literature, some interesting work suggesting that humans have these kind of these four core knowledge priors that correspond to, roughly speaking, the ability to understand and reason about space, about time, about objects and objecthood, and about agents and actions. And so you can imagine these four things being kind of like the basic building blocks for starting to build up a kind of world. And these four components will also be relevant a little bit later on as we start to think about the kinds of systems that might be supported by the conscious function architectures that we discussed earlier. We can also turn to intelligence in artificial agents. And here we find certainly that in the past decade, artificial agents have been able to solve increasingly complex tasks, increasingly large numbers of tasks. And these tasks range from playing games that are very difficult for humans to doing things like coding HTML just from text descriptions, to translating between languages, or object identification, or any number of AI tasks. I think we're all quite familiar with the advancements here. But with those advancements in mind, we can kind of put these models under the microscope of this system for measuring general intelligence that Francois Cholet has kind of laid out for us. And if we do, we find that despite being very impressive, these systems would not score so highly on this general intelligence scale by and large. These systems often require very, very large amounts of training data. So this corresponds to requiring very large amount of experience. So for in the case of like GPT style models, they're trained on the entire internet. These models are often based on a lot of imputed knowledge. So for example, in the AlphaGo model or in the StarCraft playing model, a lot of knowledge about the specific rules of the game and the nature of these games is built into the way in which the model works. Or, for example, relevant hand design priors as well. So all of this kind of suggests that perhaps these agents aren't as intelligent as they might seem at first. And it is ultimately an open question whether there is some tipping point beyond which the abilities of these agents and the number of tasks they can do might somehow start to surpass the amount of experience that's required to train them, right? So it's possible that in this kind of hypothetical case that the numerator might start to get so large that even it might outweigh the huge denominator in this measure of intelligence. I think this is still an open question, and that there are many critics, such as Gary Marcus, who are on the side of not thinking that this will be the case. But this is a talk about conscious function. And so what we are interested in, and what I'm here to talk about, is whether there is something we can take from this literature on the science of consciousness that might be useful for helping us to think about how to understand the intelligence of artificial systems and to help make these systems ultimately more generally intelligent. So we can ask this question, is there some cognitive ability at the intersection of conscious function and general intelligence? And we would want this to be something that humans consciously do, something that is associated with our general intelligence, and something that artificial agents don't do, but they in principle could. And so I'd like to propose here in this talk that this is mental time travel, or at least mental time travel is one good candidate for a worthwhile cognitive ability to focus on. So for those unfamiliar, what is mental time travel? What do I mean when I say this? Well, mental time travel was originally defined by the psychologist Ansel Tulving. Here I cite the 2002 review of his, but he had been doing work on episodic memory and mental time travel for many decades. Kind of put simply, to paraphrase here in italics, it's the ability to project oneself into the remembered past or the imagined future. And here, importantly, it's explicitly a conscious ability. It's intimately related to generally intelligent behavior. It's something that, as far as we know, only humans are capable of. There's some debate whether great apes might be able to do rudimentary forms of this, but I think that the evidence is still for only humans being able to do it. And also, I believe we haven't seen strong evidence that artificial agents can do this yet. So here on the right, I have this picture of an astronaut on the moon. And this is relevant to mental time travel because this is an example of a complex skill which could only be learned and executed by virtue of mental time travel. So in this case, we have a very large number of human beings who are able to utilize mental time travel to project themselves into an imagined future. In particular, this astronaut here was able to project himself into the imagined future in which he flew to the moon and planted a flag there. And this is, of course, something that neither he nor anyone else had ever done before. So it was certainly not a matter of simply recombining relevant pre-existing information. It was a matter of generating purely novel imagined future and then using the results of that to actually act in the world. Okay, so there's a spectrum upon which mental time travel exists. And I kind of identify four possible categories for some kind of generated experience that an agent might have. The first is what I refer to as direct experience. So this is what we're all having right now in the moment, the direct experience of me giving this talk. So this corresponds to some current trajectory through time and space in a current environment, in a current task, right? So we can see that here, our little smiley face character moves through this maze and gets the star, let's say. Then the next level of experience generation is what I refer to as replay. So here, this corresponds to the ability to generate some seen previous experience. So our little smiley character who just went to the left and got the star can then imagine, internally generate that experience again. And this is useful because we can continue to learn from that experience, for example. Next, we have this more sophisticated cognitive ability that is referred to as pre-play. So the idea here is that within the context of the same environment, the agent is able to generate an imagined experience that corresponds not to what has already happened, but what could have instead happened. So here, within the context of this T maze, the agent imagines having gone to the right instead of having gone to the left. But importantly, this is delimited by the fact that the agent could look around and see that there was a right that it could have gone to, and it's imagining it within the context of its current environment. Lastly, we have this mental time travel, which, as I suggested, is the most sophisticated. And here we have the agent that generates a trajectory to a novel part of, or an imagined version of the environment where there's some even more desirable outcome here, the heart instead of the star, in some imagined part of the task space. Okay, so mental time travel and these other forms of experience generation have all been studied in animals quite extensively in various forms. So due to the time constraints, I can't dive so much into the relevant literature, but obviously there's lots of evidence that all animals are capable of direct experience. If we then go to mammals and birds, there's a lot of experimental evidence which suggests that these animals are capable of experience replay. A lot of this evidence comes from single cell recordings in the hippocampus of rodents and other mammals, where, for example, you have some rodent which moves around in some open maze, then goes to sleep, takes a nap, pauses to rest. And if you record from the hippocampal cells, you find that the sequence of place cells that played during the movement will replay again in some kind of relevant order. You can see that here also with this like 1D version. So there have been a number of kind of hypothesized roles for this replay in terms of memory consolidation, planning, updating action values in a kind of reinforcement learning framework. But importantly, for consideration of consciousness, replay is much too fast, stereotyped, random. Often it happens in reverse. So the sequence happens kind of like the opposite to when it happened, or in the opposite order. All of this suggests that it's unlikely to be conscious in and of itself. Then we can also turn to preplay in animals. And here we find interesting evidence that in the context of certain experimental paradigms, it's possible to see kind of what I described in this figure here, where rodents are able to generate imagined trajectories to parts of an environment that they're currently in that they have not been physically in yet, but they're able to see and they're able to reason about at some level. So there's interesting experimental work showing that, which suggests that mammals probably have capacity for preplay. Then the kind of big question becomes whether or not, given that we know humans are of course capable of mental time travel, are the great apes also capable of mental time travel? This is kind of a question of debate. I think I would refer people to this paper here for a set of interesting experiments, which I think at the very least suggest that apes are capable of advanced forms of preplay, if not rudimentary forms of mental time travel. I'd be happy to talk more about these experiments in the discussion section. Lastly, we can talk a bit about mental time travel and artificial agents. So artificial agents are capable of direct experience, of course. So like every experience you feed into a neural network is kind of could be thought of that it was generated from the outside world as a kind of version of a direct experience. Replay can be thought of as being modeled, for example, by the experience replay technique that's used in deep reinforcement learning. And preplay can be thought of as corresponding to model-based deep reinforcement learning algorithms, which learn some model of the environment and then attempt to generate novel trajectories of the environment. But importantly, depending on the extent to which these model-based algorithms are able to generalize, they fall on into a kind of spectrum between being replay-based and being truly preplay-based. And I think more generally, there's no strong examples of mental time travel based artificial agents. It's also worth noting, as I mentioned before, when it comes to general intelligence in humans, humans have a set of priors which kind of govern the extent to which we're generally intelligent. So when I talk about mental time travel in terms of generating novel trajectories through unseen environments, here again, what that means is kind of limited by the human case and the case of the kind of world that humans live in. So I think what is a useful kind of set of railings or like boundaries for thinking about the possibilities of mental time travel are these four core knowledge priors of space, time, objects, and actions. So with this kind of relevant cognitive ability identified, the question now becomes, how can we use this to motivate a unification of these functional theories of consciousness and ultimately an application of them to the development of more advanced AI systems. So the way I like to think about this is with an example from Marcel Proust's famous novel, Remembrance of Lost Time. So this is a wonderful, very long, semi-autobiographical novel written in the early 20th century by the French novelist Marcel Proust. And it kind of starts off with him in old age, sitting down to eat this Madeleine cake with tea. So here's like a nice painting of that happening. And what happens is that he bites into the cake, and the smell of the cake and the taste of the cake kind of bring back all of these memories from childhood. In particular, this kind of like very vivid recollection of a particular memory from childhood kind of strikes him, and this becomes the starting point for the unfolding of the novel that then kind of goes from there. So I think what's interesting about this is that it's a very useful way of thinking about consciousness, thinking about mental time travel, because that's exactly what happens here, thinking about general intelligence and combining these three theories together. So here we have him tasting the cake, which triggers memory recall. And I think this can be understood in the context of this idea of global workspace, ignition, and broadcasting. So one modality, the smell and taste modality, kind of triggers the memory modality and the emotion modality through the global workspace. The memory recall that he then goes on is structured, creative, internally generated, and consciously experienced. So I think this is a clear case of information generation theory. And importantly, he has this kind of meta representation of himself as doing the remembering. So he's not like kind of caught up in or lost in the reverie. In fact, he is explicitly the author of his memories because he's the narrator and the writer of the book. And so here we have this nice case of this attention schema at play, which is like necessarily structuring and guiding the work that he's doing. So I think this is kind of like a very nice poetic way of thinking about combining these three theories into what is ultimately not kind of like three separate competing ways of thinking about cognitive information access, but is rather kind of like one bigger system with these three separate components, and that each of these three components can all work together to enable things like mental time travel and ultimately lead to more general intelligence. So here is a kind of diagram of what I think this more fully realized system might look like. So we have some set of low-level modules, cognitive modules. These are then interacted through bottom-up and top-down projections with an information generator, which is guided and structured by this kind of structuring cognitive map system. It is then the information that is internally generated that gets sent into the global workspace and broadcast back out. And then this, the content of this global workspace and the functioning of the global workspace is structured by this higher level metacognitive representation that is the attention schema. And this is a kind of three-part system that can also, I think, be represented in this other kind of way, which is to say that we have these kind of three relevant edges, these three relevant pillars: global workspace, information generation theory, and attention schema theory. We can imagine systems that combine each of these two. And I would make the claim that in order to get to true mental time travel, we need systems that incorporate all three. So we can start looking at and thinking about systems that currently exist, AI systems that touch on each of these. And here I'll just give a couple examples that I think are relevant. So for information generation theory, we have for the information generator side, the past year has seen amazing work, for example, in the context of image generation, DALL-E and Stable Diffusion. In terms of the structuring aspect, this cognitive map part that I've been discussing, there's also been very interesting work, for example, by Whittington and colleagues, looking at learning these kind of hippocampal-like cognitive map representations that can be used to kind of unsupervised learn structured groundings in these artificial agents. In the global workspace theory side of things, there's been a lot of great work. Here I cite two works of Goyle. There's been a lot of great work from Yoshua Bengio's lab and many others looking at implementing global workspace explicitly or taking ideas from global workspace and attempting to implement them. In terms of the attention schema theory, there have been a number of different lines of work. For example, work taking explicit models of attention and building them into RL agents, which is what I have cited here at the top. There's also relevant work, I think, around meta reinforcement learning in the prefrontal cortex, which is related to this idea of the schema learning and context selection. Then we can turn to the kind of combinations of these different functional systems. So the combination of global workspace and information generation theory involves systems that are both internally generating information and broadcasting them to some kind of global workspace. Here are two relevant works. The conscious Turing machine is one, and then here is Zhao et al. Is another work from Bengio's lab from last year. The global workspace and attention schema theory, I interpret this as this kind of work where you have some global workspace, but the kind of rules and the dynamics that govern the nature of the workspace are being dynamically changed. And there's interesting work from Van Rudlen and Kanai, which kind of proposes this global latent workspace that has this kind of flavor to it. Lastly, up until today, I didn't have a slot for IGT and AST, but I was thinking a bit about it, and I think it could be the case that in terms of attention schema theory and information generation theory, these very large language models might be thought of as versions of this, where you have some ability to internally generate information like coherent text, but also you have this ability to start to do rapid in-context learning, which can be thought of as this kind of like meta representation of context that an attention schema might provide. But lastly and importantly, even though there's been relevant progress made on all sides, the combination of all of these things together is still yet to really be convincingly done towards mental time travel. But I think if and when it is done, it'll lead to impressive results in the field of AI. So finally, to conclude, I think there's a lot of work to be done at the intersection, and hopefully this kind of triangle is a useful way of thinking about the way in which conscious function might relate to AI research. I think mental time travel is a valuable goal, and the question of whether it can be turned into a concrete benchmark that isn't just exploitable is an interesting question, is maybe one that I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on. So lastly, to kind of go back to our motivating question, is there some relationship between consciousness and intelligence? I would say if we take the kind of narrow definitions that we've used in this work, where we take consciousness to mean cognitive information access, and we say that information access involves or requires these relevant functional mechanisms, and that these mechanisms enable mental time travel, and mental time travel enables general intelligence. And yes, there is this kind of clear path from functional consciousness to general intelligence. Yeah, and that's my talk. I'd like very much to thank my collaborators, Kai, Jun, and Ryota at Araya. They all gave me lots of very useful feedback during the iterations of this, especially Kai, who was intimately involved in writing the paper himself. If you'd like to read the paper, there's the citation here. You can use the QR code to find the link. Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to talking with you all about the work.